Everybody, welcome to Secular Sunday. Welcome to Lehigh Valley Humanists. Now this month, we're back to Secular Sunday speaker series. I know a lot of you are very politically minded and you keep up with the news and current events and stuff. Now here at LVH, we're a nonprofit organization, so we don't endorse or oppose any specific candidates, but we certainly voice our opinion on views, on issues. And there was one issue that was really, it seems to have not been as much on the forefront within the last few weeks, but about a month ago or so, it was one of the hot news issues, one of the controversial issues, one of the issues that a lot of people were arguing over. And of course, I'm referring to the crisis in Syria and the refugees and how the world and this country is going to respond to that. And what I love to see is that when there's people in this group who see challenges in the world and they become passionate about it, and that passion moves them to act and try to help. And that's what we really have in this case is we have our own member Paula Shea, who is very passionate about the Syrian refugee crisis, and she's gone out and she's talked to some of the other groups that are already working on some potential solutions here in the Lehigh Valley. And so she's networked with them, she's made connections with them, and she's here this morning to tell us a little bit about some background information about the crisis, and then also what are some potential things, some potential ways that perhaps people can help. All right, so with no further ado, I will turn it over to Paula Shea.
So, in order to explain what's going on in Syria today, we actually have to look back first at the history of Syria, not going back to 2011, as the media will tell you, you can figure it out from there, but going back 100 years ago. Syria had been for hundreds of years, so something like 700 years, part of the Ottoman Empire. It was World War I that led it to coming under French control, and that lasted for about 30 years. And then in 1945, they gained independence, and they became a founding member of the United Nations. They had a brief union with Egypt that was known as the United Arab Republic, but that ended in 1961. And then in 1963, the secular Arab socialist Ba'ath Party overtook the government. So a little bit more about the Ba'ath Socialist Party. The objective of the Ba'ath Party was to unite the Arab world as one. It was referred to as Pan-Arabism. It was founded in 1947 by Michael Affleck, which you can guess what religion he was. He was a Christian. It was founded by Michael Affleck, a Christian, and Salah al-Din al-Bitar, who was a Sunni Muslim, and the followers of Zaki al-Arzuzi, who was actually an atheist. And that was all in Damascus, Syria. It referred to itself as the Party of Arab Unity. And the idea was that they were uniting everyone in the Arab world, regardless of religion. So it was not founded on any basis of religion. And it did rely on the subjugation of the regional minorities, such as the Kurds, which comes into play later in history. Their motto is unity, liberty, and socialism. Unity stood for the creation of an independent, strong Arab nation. Liberty meant freedom from colonial oppression after they had just gotten out of French control, and freedom of speech and thought. Socialism was not defined the same as it is here in the West. It was a unique form of Arab socialism. Affleck is the one who coined the term that you see up here. This is their modern day website, one Arab nation with an immortal mission. What he meant was that the Arab world had had significant influence on the history of the entire world, that it had a lot of global influence and that they had left their mark in history. He never thought anyone would misinterpret what that means, one Arab nation with an immortal mission. So they began to radicalize the meaning of socialism over time and the meaning of the Ba'ath Party. There was also a former member of the Syrian Communist Party who came into involvement in that and started controlling what they meant by socialism. So then we have Hafez al-Assad. He was born in 1930. He was a peasant. His actual family name was not al-Assad. That was a name that he took on. His original name was Wash, which meant savage. And he decided he wanted to be called the Lion, so he changed it to al-Assad. So it's not even actually their family name. It's something they took on. He joined the newly formed Ba'ath Party as a teenager. He was 17 when it was formed, so he joined it then. After graduating high school, he went straight into the Air Force College. He graduated, he rose to the ranks. He, as General al-Assad, because he became a general, he led what was called the corrective movement, and where he seized power and became the prime minister. A year later, he declared himself president. He was just like, I'm your president, and overtook the entire government. So that escalated quickly. That's a picture of his family from the 1970s, him and his wife, and their children. And what I like about this picture, you really can't tell that they're not just in America somewhere. So a lot of people love him and a lot of people hate him. He did actually improve education and healthcare. The economy stabilized under his control. He made a history that he actually met with President Bush in 1991 for a Middle Eastern peace conference. The significance of that is it involved negotiations with Israel, which that was like the enemy of Syria. So the fact that he was negotiating with them was significant. He's cooperated with the US several times, and he had helped to free hostages from Lebanon in the 1980s. Some of the cons, though, were pretty significant. There was the Hama massacre in 1982, in which the Syrian Arab army, under the order of President Assad and under the command of his brother, General Assad, seized control of the town of Hama for almost a month to crush an anti-Assad uprising that was led by the Muslim Brotherhood. The reports vary. There's no agreement on how many deaths there were. It's somewhere between 1,000 and 40,000. It's a huge range. Even the groups that looked into it and investigated, they still had ranges of like 10 to 30,000. They couldn't estimate how many people died in that massacre. That's a picture of someone smashing a statue of him from 2015. So in 1992, there was this article that said, this was talking about the Hama massacre then. A journalist interviewed them. Although most of the people in Hama refused to speak with me, one Sunni Muslim told me the same thing I heard from Sunnis in other cities. There will be a civil war. We Syrians are far from our book. He predicted fighting only after the 60-year-old Assad, who had a history of heart problems, died. So Assad ends up dying of heart problems. But in 1994, his oldest son, Basil, died in a car accident, which suddenly turned attention to his second oldest son, Bashar. They really wanted Basil to take over, but Bashar was now the next in line that was being prepared for presidency. Bashar entered the military right away in 94 and propelled through the ranks. He became Hafez's political advisor, and they worked together to remove all the rivals for the future election, because they had to ensure that he would be elected, so they got rid of all competition. It's a democracy, they get to vote for him, but he's the only one you can vote for. In 2000, President Hafez Assad died of a heart attack. The vice president, Qaddam, took over for about a week. It was very brief, and he was on a committee to decide who would run, but Bashar stepped in and said, no, I'm the only one running. And everybody had to vote for him, so they had 99% that voted for him in their democracy. It was unopposed. He gained office in place of his father. Significant events in the next decade. In 2004, the prime minister of Lebanon, Rafik Hariri, was assassinated. Now, Qaddam, the one that had been the vice president, he believed Assad was responsible. Many people believed Assad was responsible. So he left Syria completely, Qaddam did. And in 2007, Bashar won another unopposed ballot, and he was reelected for the next 7 years. During all that time, there had been a major drought, a lot of government mismanagement. It forced a lot of people to move out of less populated areas in the agricultural regions. The cities became very crowded, and food prices were spiking. It was in March 6, 2011, that some school children in Dara wrote, that's a city in Syria, wrote anti-government messages on a wall, including the people want the fall of the regime, the people want to topple the regime. They wrote things against Assad. The 15 children were thrown into jail. March 15th, so a couple weeks later, was known as the Day of Rage. Protesters marched into Damascus and Aleppo. In Damascus, security forces responded very violently to them. On March 18th, Day of Dignity, they organized through Facebook. They set up a Facebook page for the Syrian Revolution and began peaceful protests all over, demanding the release of the school children who were still in jail. The security forces opened fire on them and killed several people. March 19th and 20th, they were having funerals for the protesters who were killed. Security forces attacked them at the funerals, threw tear gas at them. When they brought protesters in, there was a mosque they had set up as a hospital. They brought protesters there. They threw bombs into that and grenades, and they killed doctors who were treating protesters. So this is a picture from March 2011. The people marching into Damascus, they were chanting, Dara is Syria. We sacrifice our blood, our souls for you in Dara. So this is all to protect the children, or in defense of the children that were arrested. The families pleaded for their release. One official allegedly said, forget your children. If you really want your children, you should make more children. If you don't know how to make children, we'll show you how to do it. The children were between 10 and 15 years old. They were all boys. They were eventually released, but in the month that they had been held in jail, they were tortured. They were questioned and interrogated on what group are you with, which terrorists are you acting for, why are you against Assad. They had their fingernails pulled out, they were burnt with cigarettes, they were tortured in other horrible ways. So they were alive, but very horrible. Bashar referred to them as the enemy because they said anti-Assad statements. And over the next year, he killed over 600 children. Some were tortured before they were killed. Snipers would shoot children of all ages. So people became very afraid to walk anywhere because they would get shot by snipers. Another significant one that was, it was a month after the first event, so in April 2011, there was a 13-year-old who was arrested and tortured, and then he was returned, just his body was returned mutilated, very, very horribly mutilated. There's pictures online, it's terrible, but to his family. The schools were turned into detention centers. There were no longer any students going to school. There's two different flags you'll see in pictures, especially when you see them all over the media, not to confuse them here. The Syrian Arab Republic flag, which is the flag of Syria, is often used by the pro-Assad government people. The Syrian Revolution flag is the flag that Syria had prior to the Assad regime. So that's the one that you'll see a lot of the protesters using. Sometimes protesters will use the Syria flag because they have a lot of pride in their country, but they just don't feel Assad stands for it. So this one shows the independence flag that's being used at a protest. During all of this that was going on the first couple of years, there were pro-Assad rallies that were being held everywhere. People for the government that were cheering for Assad, that were saying he's our one and true courageous leader, and that were telling the protesters to stop. So you might wonder, when did ISIS invade Syria? There is not really a clear answer on that because it depends how you define which terrorist groups and how you define ISIS. There's a lot of overlap. The war began as the rebels versus Assad. It was a political war. Jihadist groups turned it into a religious war because they didn't like that. The other thing I didn't mention was that Hafez Assad was from the Alawite sect of Islam. So he wasn't what the majority was, which was the Sunni Muslims. So a lot of people objected to him for religious reasons because it wasn't the right type of Islam for them. But most people that were leading the protests, their objection was his political power and the way he was responding. So President Bashar Assad has denied that he's had any involvement with ISIS, but they have helped him in that they've been fighting the rebels and he's fighting the rebels. So he hasn't actually been fighting ISIS very much because their fight against the rebels is helping him. So here's a list of some of the different groups that are involved. It's a very partial list. There's the Free Syrian Army, which was the first recognized military opposition to the Assad regime. Because of the jihadists that rose in that group, it became more than just a political battle. So they started splitting off, and there were a lot of different, they didn't know why they were fighting Assad anymore, so they divided into different groups. There were Islamist Syrian rebels that came up. They've been backed by the Gulf states because the Gulf states didn't like Assad, so they were helping them. There's international jihadist groups that moved in on this opportunity when the civil war started up. Nusra Front is the name that you see a lot in the news, and that's Al-Qaeda's affiliate in Syria. They branched away from ISIS in 2013. And the Assad regime has the National Defense Army. I think this is cut off a little bit, but it has the National Defense Army. That's the Syrian army fighting for Assad. And this is supposed to look ridiculous, but this is from a blog that was explaining all the different groups fighting each other. So the red arrows are showing if they're fighting someone, the green arrows are if they're supporting someone. It's a mess. It's a complete mess. And most of the time, people don't even know what group they're in or who they're fighting anymore. The Hula massacre was another significant event. That was May 25th, 2012 in Tel Dou, at the Hula region of Syria near Homs. There were 108 people killed that day, 34 women and 49 children. Earlier in that day, there had been a crowd of protesters that was dispersed by gunfire by Syrian soldiers. That wasn't anything too new in what had happened over the last year. There had been a lot of protests dispersed by gunfire. However, that night, people came in breaking into homes from neighboring towns, and they herded civilians into groups. They would shoot entire families. There was one report I read that was a mother she survived it, but she said that she had said to one of the shooters who had a gun to her head, "Don't make my son an orphan." So they turned away from her and said, "Fine, I won't," shot the son, and let her live. There were around 20 deaths that were from tank or artillery fire, but the rest were done execution style, and most were entire families that were killed. In August 2012, the UN investigators released an official report saying that it was most likely Syrian troops and the Shabaya militia, which was an Alawite group that had formed an armed militia in support of the Ba'ath Party, and that they were responsible for the massacre, was what the UN officially reported. Assad denied that. He said he was not involved, and he blamed al-Qaeda. This was also after the Hula massacre that the people of the town were saying, "We are not terrorists," because Assad said, "This is your own fault. You brought this upon yourself." Who can guess who this is? Yes, that's Bashar's wife. He likes to kind of use her as a figure to show how modern and progressive he is. She was raised in London. Her parents were Syrian born, though, so she was born and raised in London. She's known for her fashion sense and her modern style. In March 2011, that's with the outbreak of the Syrian war, she was published in Vogue magazine in an article titled "A Rose in the Desert." They later pulled that article off their website because of everything that was happening in Syria. There's been a lot of speculation and talk about her because she wasn't really heard from much since 2012. And then people started saying, well, maybe she fled the country, maybe she's not even with Assad anymore. So she made like one brief appearance in 2013, said, "No, I'm still here, I will always stand by my husband." Didn't say much other than that. So now a lot of people think that she doesn't have much freedom or control or anything, but they always like to talk about her prior to the Civil War. She would go around talking about how much she loves Western style and her children would eat Western food. And she, like I said, she was London born and raised. So this is Bashar's current wife. This is a man, meanwhile, while Bashar's wife was showing off, this is a man that's running through a home city to avoid sniper shots just so he can bring his groceries home, just trying to live his daily life. The damage of the Civil War, if we sum up what's happened so far, by June 2011, there had been 1,400 people killed, 10,000 arrested by the regime. Including from that time until 2014, 200,000 people were killed. So you can see how quickly that escalated in the next 3 years. Millions were driven from their homes. As of 2012, there had been 100,000 refugees, meaning they left the country, they were refugees. Present day, the total death is estimated around 300,000. That's probably a very low number. There are 1.5 million that are injured, many are permanently disabled. The economy is completely shattered. Doctors' offices, hospitals are gone. The schools have not been opened since the outbreak of the Civil War, so children have not been in school since 2011. And there are 7 million Syrians that are displaced from their country. 7 million displaced within the country that are homeless now because their cities have been bombed. 4 to 6 million that have left as refugees. You can see how quickly that went from 2011 to now. These are some before and after pictures. The first one showing a mosque in Aleppo, which was a huge historic place. It was a popular tourist attraction because of how old it was. So that's 2012 in the top photo, 2013 in the bottom one. Over on this side, this was a big successful marketplace, also in Aleppo. 2009 on the top, 2012 in the bottom one. Syrians take a lot of pride in medical and healthcare. They had a lot of very successful hospitals and excellent doctors. That's at one of the big hospitals that they had. Again, this is in Aleppo. And then 2012 in the top, 2013, hospitals gone. This is a street and homes. Again, 2011, 2014 is the bottom one. The Russian airstrikes, which you've heard on the news, September 2015, President Bashar Assad officially requested the Russian aerospace forces to target ISIS and the rebels. So he was asking both the ISIS, the outside groups that had come in that were terrorists, and the rebels that were fighting against Assad. He wanted Russia to bomb both of them. The US also got involved at that time. But I just took one statement from President Obama in 2015. He said he was unable to foresee a situation in which we can end the civil war in Syria while Assad remains in power. At that time, Obama had urged Russia and Iran to stop supporting the Syrian government. This is a baby that was rescued from the rubble after an airstrike in Aleppo in 2014. So that's not that man's baby, but that's one that he found in the rubble. This map shows where the airstrikes have taken place. What's interesting to see is that blue area. Any of the blue areas are the ones that are controlled by the rebels. but well, it says Sunni insurgents here, but it's really all the rebels that are against Assad. And the Russian airstrikes are the red dots. So the Russians were told to bomb ISIS, which is the black area, to bomb ISIS and the rebels. And they just mostly went after the rebels. They were not so much targeting ISIS, just a little bit here and there. The black dots are the US airstrikes. They were going after the ISIS-controlled areas, although there's still plenty of civilians that were injured in those airstrikes. And there's been a lot of protests by the Syrian civilians saying, please stop bombing us, both to Russia and the US. So you can see just the difference in where Russia and the US were striking, where they had control over. If you haven't already looked at it, I encourage you to go onto Humans in New York page and read through some of the stories, especially in light of some of this information. See some of these, they did documentaries on, and it was in December of last year, that for refugees that had been accepted. And I'm going to talk more about the refugee process in a little bit. I'm not going to read all of these right now, but these are some stories that they had posted. This one I liked this story because the woman was a doctor in her town. And one thing about Syrian women, a lot of them are, because they do value medicine so much, there's a lot of nurses and doctors that are Syrian women. So ISIS tried to recruit her as a doctor and to get her husband to manage a hospital for them. They ended up fleeing from them and they did escape as refugees. This shows you where the refugees are. I think this was updated as of February, so this is, as of last month, where the refugees are that are around Syria. There is 6.6 million people displaced within their country, so they're wandering around. They don't have homes right now within their country. There's about 2.6 million refugees in Turkey. These are at refugee camps. They're not permanently staying there, although some of them might be granted asylum, especially in Jordan. 600,000 in Jordan. There's about 1 million in Lebanon, and 240,000 in Iraq. About 100,000 in Egypt. This was another story about the boy had been hit by a motorcycle outside his home. His father went to bring him to the hospital. There were no doctors in the hospital. He didn't know what to do. He couldn't do anything. So he was accepted as a refugee, but when they get it, he was saying here, when they get him to America, they're going to have to break his leg again to be able to fix it. All this time has gone by. He hasn't been able to see a doctor. Political cartoons. We despise war and killing of slaughters and innocents. That's a load of anti-Christian terrorist talk. Get out. This shows the refugee ceiling, which every year the president and a committee decide on how many total refugees from all countries will be accepted to the US. This is not since the Syrian civil war. This is since forever. It's been like decades they've been doing this. So the light blue part is showing the ceiling that was set, the maximum number of refugees they'll accept, and then the dark blue shows you how many actually were admitted to the country. Again, this is total number, not Syrian. What they just decided on, because they met in January to decide on it, is that it's going to be 85,000 this year. 10,000 of those will be Syrian refugees. So when you hear that number, 10,000 Syrian refugees, how do we handle this many? It's a small percent of the total refugees, which is fairly consistent with what we've been accepting for many years. So it is a little bit higher than, actually, Obama had lowered the ceiling for a few years in a row, but it's a little bit higher than what we have been taking. It's really not that much more, and the Syrians are only a small percent of that. Afghanistan was always the highest amount until the Syrian civil war. Last couple of years, that shifted it a little bit. To qualify as a refugee, they undergo a rigorous screening process, more thorough than any other method of entering the country, extensive interviews, security clearance. They cannot be firmly established in any country already, and they have to prove a well-founded fear of persecution. There's a long list of reasons they'll be rejected. If they have any kind of moral criminal background that's questionable in the least, they will be rejected as a refugee. Health-related issues, if they're polygamous, they will be rejected. Very small percent of Syrians are polygamous, by the way. Even though most are Muslim, it's not something they follow. If they have any misrepresentation of any facts, they will be rejected. It takes 18 to 24 months to get through the 9-step process to be accepted as a refugee to the US. Less than 1% of applicants make it past the first step. So, do we feel safe? This was another Humans in New York one. I encourage you to read that too. She was given a deferred letter saying that she wasn't accepted, but then she was accepted actually, so. After arriving in the US, all the responsibility is turned over to a volunteer agency. They're responsible for assuring that services are provided in the first 90 days, food, housing, clothing, cultural orientation, employment, etc. 1 year after admission, a refugee can apply to be a lawful permanent resident. If approved, they can petition for naturalization 5 years after arrival. There's very little federal funding that's given for refugee resettlement, And refugees actually have to pay back their plane ticket and a lot of expenses. That is not given to them, it's a loan. So most of the expenses are more for the paperwork and things, like that's what the funding is going towards. And it has not increased in recent years to account for inflation or the increased need. This is a list of the 9 US private agencies which cooperate with the State Department for Refugee Resettlement. What's one thing you notice about this list? They're all religious. So these are private nonprofit groups that work with the government for refugee resettlement. These are the only 9 nonprofit groups that work with the government for refugee resettlement. There's like one that's secular, but that's about it. Facts about refugees. This is on Syrian refugees now, so specifically Syrians, but the majority of them are under 18, so under 14 being the largest group. This is showing education. So the red part is 6% have a university education, but this is including children. If you look at only the ones that are 25 years or older, 39% have a college education of admitted refugees. That's higher than the US-born citizens here for the percent that are college educated in that age group. It helps them with their acceptance process if they have an education. And again, I'm just going to skip these, so I'm not wasting more time. This guy had designed this house, and he had it built. He was an architect, and his family was in it when it was bombed by an airstrike, so he lost a lot of his family. Ways that you can help today. One important thing is to just speak up against the backlash and the ignorance, because there are so many misunderstood facts about what's going on, how the refugee process works. So speaking up about it is not just like pointless bickering. There's a lot of people who just don't know anything about how the process works or about accepting refugees or what's going on in Syria. So they're afraid for legitimate reasons, but just because they don't know the facts. So speaking up against it really does help. Vote in favor of increasing the number of Syrian refugees that are accepted, or write to senators and other politicians showing your support. And stay informed about current events and volunteer opportunities. I've been following a couple different Facebook pages, and I've gone to a few different volunteer groups. Our local organizations there's the Lutheran and Children's Services in Allentown. Again, it's religious, however, the only groups helping them are religious. They really don't preach to the refugees coming in. They are just working to help them with housing and with food. They're not changing their religion or anything like that. They just help them to get settled, to find housing. So they do need volunteers for helping with sorting through donations, which is something I did one day. There's also Church World Services, which is down in Lancaster. I'm going to talk more about that. I have a list of, and I'll get to that in the next slide. Also, Every Campus Has a Refuge is an organized effort to provide housing for refugees on college campuses. Lauren Strong from the Humanists is working more on that, so if you're more interested in finding out about the effort on that part, talk to Lauren Strong. She would be the one to contact. That's partnered with Church World Services, with CWF. So I've been talking to the volunteer coordinator, and the one main thing they need now is supplies to help the refugees get resettled into their new homes as they arrive. We're expecting to get a lot more than there have been. To date, there have only been 2,800 Syrian refugees since 2011 have been admitted to the US. So when you hear there's tens of thousands that we brought in, it's not true. 2,800, most of those, the large majority of them, were in the last 2 years. And we're looking now at taking 10,000 over the next year. So that is a significant increase for the number of Syrian refugees, not the number of total refugees that we've taken in history, though. It's just that the need for Syrian refugees has increased. So I have this list of supplies. I do have some handouts you can take with you that include this. Even if you're able to bring in just some supplies, I'll be collecting them next month. I'm going to be bringing them down to Lancaster, where they set up new houses for the refugees as they arrive, so that's one way to help. And just for a little bit of my history, that's my great-grandfather in 1941 in Newcastle. He was a Syrian immigrant. He came over when it was still part of the Ottoman Empire. And that's my grandmother and my great-great-grandmother, all Syrian. So, questions? Yes?
What's the difference between technically or legally a refugee and an immigrant?
Immigrant is a cover-all term. That just means they're coming to the country. So it can include refugee, it can include asylum, it can include like any other immigrant that's come from another country, if they've come to this country to live permanently. So immigrants is like the catch-all phrase for that they are immigrating to this country. So that includes refugees. One common question I've heard is what's the difference between refugee and asylum, because there is a distinction between that. Asylum means that they had to have gotten here first. no matter what the method is, if they crossed the border illegally or whatever they did, or if they got up to the border. And then they have to say that they are in fear of, a well-founded fear of persecution, that if they are sent back, they will be killed, is what they have to prove. So you can be granted asylum if you show up at the door or if you get across the border, that the US won't kick you out because they'd be killing you if they did, basically, is what that means. So asylum is different than the refugee process. Refugees have to be applying from outside the country. So they're in camps in Jordan, in Turkey, they're in camps that are elsewhere, applying to become a refugee. They don't get a choice about where they're sent. They're told by the refugee resettlement where they go. But they're all immigrants if they're coming here. Yes?
The thing that sort of shifted the conversation, it seems to me, from Syrian refugees to Syrian refugees are terrorists. You know, from the French, what happened in Paris, that one of the bombers had a fake Syrian passport, and just based on that, that's when there was all that hoopla and all the Republicans, we're not taking in any refugees.
Yeah.
Because they're terrorists.
Well, and that also goes back to how many different groups are fighting in this. It's not like us versus them. It's not like two sides to this war. There are so many different groups, and they're very manipulative, and they do things like that. You have that one terrorist group that's going to plant that evidence there to say, like, let's blame the Syrians, because by hurting the refugee process, by keeping more people in Syria, it's giving the government and the terrorists more power over them. And that's what they want. They don't want the refugees to leave and get resettled elsewhere. So it's...
Whether that was actually true or not. All you hear is that there was one fake passport. It's a fake passport! And yet there's enormous hoopla, and it converted the whole conversation, it seems to me, to be they're all terrorists.
Yeah.
They're all going to kill us.
I want to follow up on that. Can you confidently say that there were no Syrian refugees in the Paris massacres?
I didn't research the Paris massacres very well to be able to say that. I don't know of any refugees that were... I'm not sure what the number was on how many refugees had been accepted there. What I do know is that because, I know the US process of accepting refugees. I don't know what it is in France. But I know that the process in the US is so thorough and every little detail of a background check. And the fact that it takes 2 years to accept them and that they fingerprint them, they're doing a full health scan. If they have the least bit of a criminal background, if they have any ties to, even if they're one of the rebels, they won't be accepted, even if they're anti-Assad, because they could have a connection. They don't know which ones are the terrorists and who's a terrorist and who's this. It's so many different groups involved. So the refugees are typically civilians that are caught in the middle of things that aren't really involved in any groups. But I don't know enough about the Paris massacre to really.
We'll do one more question, and then are you going to stick around afterwards?
Yeah, I'll be here for lunch.
Questions for Paula afterwards when we're done. We have one more question.
Yeah.
I know there's a fairly large Syrian community in Allentown.
Largest in the U.S.
Are they do they have special movements that, if we can help, are they forming groups that...
They've been forming... They've been, there aren't any from the Syrian civil war. There are many, many Syrian refugees in Allentown that are from prior to that. There are none that are from the civil war. So we've really only had 2 families that have come over in Pennsylvania that are since 2011 from Syria. Which is also something I think is misrepresented a lot, but they tend to have a lot of their own groups. They do interfaith meetings, because there's Christians and there's Muslims and there's all different ones within Syria. So they do a lot of their own meetings. I went to one of their meets where they did have a lot of Syrian immigrants that were there. They didn't have a lot of the refugees that had other family that will be coming over this next year, because they were worried about being connected to any big attention, because there was news media there and everything. But there's not, the Lutheran Children and Family Services is the main group to contact in Allentown for volunteer opportunities directly, but it's difficult to work directly with refugees. I've been trying, because you have to be past a whole lot of security clearances to be able to just work with them.
Good. Thank you very much, Paula Shea.